Hello everyone, I'm Miss Gian, and today we're diving into chapter 6, which covers validity. So, I'll say big questions of validity. Validity. So, does a test actually measure what it claims to measure? Ba? The question sounds simple, pero as we'll go along, we probably will be a little bit technical. It's also a bit nuanced than it appears to be. So, stay with me. We'll do our best to make this simple. So, ipos-pos lang gid siya. Basta maglibog na, sakit na ang utok. Pero bearable ra gid siya. Okay? So, on sa tong learning objective, by the end of this hour, here's what you should be able, I hope you should be able to do. First is that you'll be able to define validity and explain why it matters so much in assessment. In fact, a test that is reliable is still not considered a good test if it's not valid. So it's one of the main and core criteria of the psychometric soundness of a certain test. And second is that you'll understand the difference between face validity and other types of validity. So this one here it trips people up, so pay attention. And then third is you'll learn about content validity and also how to calculate something called the content validity ratio. And then fourth, we'll cover the difference between concurrent and predictive validity. And then hopefully you'll also understand what construct validity is, which is the umbrella that covers everything else. And last, we'll talk about test bias and fairness, which are two concepts that are often very much confused, but are actually quite different. So let's proceed. So, unsa din ang validity? What is exactly its definition? So, its textbook definition is that it is a judgment or estimate of how well a test measures what it purports to measure. Okay, so let me break that down. When we talk about validity, we're talking about the inferences we draw from test scores, the conclusions. Example, ano sa inference? These are the conclusions that we make. So when there's the score, we derive an inference out from that. And ang validation, it is the process of gathering and evaluating evidence about validity. Now, here's something really important to remember. Walay test na universally valid. Okay? So, unsay meaning ani? Dili ka kaingon na at this one point in time in a certain country, example sa US, na ay exam or exam ba na ay test. Mga naka-valid ni siya. So, inigabot sa Philippines, valid ni siya all throughout. No, thinking this way is wrong. Okay? Because no test is universally valid. Validity depends on who you're testing, what you're using the test for, and when you're using it. So, hope that's clear. Now, this is very important to remember. Now, let's go over the Trinitarian view of validity. So, unsa din yung Trinitarian view sa validity? So, natay tulo ka categories. We have content validity, criterion related validity, and also construct validity. So, each of these three will be covering deeply and in depth in the next few slides. So, unsa nang content validity? Does the test sample the right behaviors? Criterion, does test scores relate to outcomes? And then construct is, does the test measure the construct? So before we push towards the actual discussion, I have here a discussion question, our first ever discussion question. So imagine that a psychology test was developed in the 1960s. And at that time, it showed strong validity for measuring intelligence. So my question is, can we assume it remains valid today? So, when you're thinking about the answer to this one, I want you to think about cultural changes. What could be the cultural changes that would make a test developed in 1960 valid to 2025? Diba? Wala pa yung AI at that time. So, how can you say that it really did measure intelligence? That's content, right? And also the population. So, lahi na evolve ba yung tao? Like society changes, so does people changes because people is part of society. So, mana siya, no? That's exactly why validity has to be re-established over time. Kay ang test na na-develop pag 1960 might not work the same way karon pag 2026. 2025 pa to ako yun last time. But you get the point, right? Okay, so next, we will be talking about face validity. Okay? Ang tawag niya sa textbook is Rodney Dangerfield of Psychometric Variables. Nga naman because wala kayo siya respect from researchers. Some scholars, some researchers do not even consider this as one of the criteria for psychometric soundness. Pero as psychometricians, as test users, this is still important. Why is it important? Because face validity is about how relevant test items appear to be the person, how relevant test items appear to be to the person being tested. So not what the test actually measures. So meaning it is judged from the test taker's perspective. So ako, for example, test taker ko, ni-answer kong test, niya pagtanaw na ako, personality test, human pagkita na ako, uy, ano man ni ang content kan nag-talk about man ni siya kanang history, di ba? So, or pagkita na ako, di magkadimao ang pages, ba katag. So, of course, I wouldn't trust whatever the score will be produced from the test. If it doesn't look valid to the person taking it, that's gonna be me. No, if it doesn't look valid to me, so I might not do my best in answering it well. So there's that variable, di ba? And then if I don't do my best, if I could na siya patakan og answer, and then, meaning to say, dili siya, kung whatever score it is, does not represent really the ability of my true ability. And also, if ako, administrator ko, or test user ko, I might not even buy it, di ba? Mura ra gud na packaging mo palit mo packaging na kanang na tear or packaging na dent. So same as test pod, no? If I'm test user, I'm not gonna buy that test from a test developer that's not really looking like a test. I'm gonna give a more specific example. So, for example, naatay that asks about kanang social situations or social behavior in certain situations. So, of course, if you look at it, it has high face validity. Kay obviously, it looks like it measures what it says. Pero if you compare it to ink blot, di ba? You're familiar with it. Kana na ay blots sa ink. And then nakaingnon ana na murag what do you see, and then you might not really consider it as high in face validity because how can you exactly, if I'm the test user ba, it will make me think na how does what I see in this blob have anything to do with my personality ba? So that's considered a low face validity. Again, face validity is on the perspective ni test taker. Pero here's a very important thing to consider. A very important. A test can lack face validity and still be perfectly valid. Okay? Face validity is more about public relations than actual psychometric soundness. I mentioned this one already na dili kayo siya gi-consider sa researchers or psychometricians because of this one. Even if batignaw ang imuhang test, even if it does not appear to measure personality perhaps, it could still be considered a valid test, like the Rorschach ink blot test, the thematic perception test, right? So hope that's clear. Now, let's go over content validity. Now, unlike face validity, content validity is one of the clear criteria on how we consider a test to be a valid or good or has a psychometrically sound measure. So, what's ang content validity? It is a judgment of how adequately a test samples behavior representative of the universe of behavior the test was designed to sample. So, for example, you have here burnout, right? And there are a lot of behaviors that we can say that a person is burnt out. It could manifest in school, it could manifest in personal life, it could manifest in basta pa man na, mga dealings with yourself and etc. No? Not a universe of behavior of that certain construct. Now, imagine if you're testing out only one portion of that, no? Sample kanira imuhang gikuha. That means you cannot really say na imuhang test has content validity. Kaya wala man kani sample sa tanang domains where makuan siya, where possible siya mo show up. Okay, so hope that's clear. In a universe of behaviors, your content validity measures how well you sample a certain number of behaviors to the universe of behavior. Okay, so I know it's kind of abstract, but it will be understandable as we go on. So, example, sa educational mga test, na mga achievement test, or example, midterm exam. So, if naa kay midterm exam sa psych assessment, unya, ang gi-cover sa midterm exam is 80% statistics. 80% na compute din hag person R, ug unsa pa na din ha. Pero ang exam or gitudlo is the whole chapter, whole 13 chapter. So the exam then, we can say does not really sample your learning of the course. No, it does not have content validity or has a content validity problem. So, kung example, pwede po bali no example, ang inyo gi-cover is Kotobra chapters 1 to 5. Anya, ang exam is, ang exam is 20% each chapter from 1 to 13. So, na po siya content validity problem, okay? May gana gali mo, reklamo mo sa inyong teachers, dapat buwan ang mga miss, dili siya content, wala siya content validity mo exam. Masya, makuan dyan na sila, no? Mawindang sa inyong pangbuhaton na mga response. Ito, nabuhata ha, kaya kasi mabalikan ko, ana. So, same po sa employment, no? Gabi po og ka ng kuan. Gabi pong tanaw sa content validity kay hiring decision na good na. So, whatever your test battery is, if I haven't mentioned it already, a test battery is a collection of tests. Okay, so for example, personality test, intelligence test, attention to detail test, unsa pa na din ha. Kani siyang tulo is a test battery. Okay, so your test battery or your test should be a representative sample of that job related skill that's required for the position. And you can't give someone a personality test that you can give someone a random personality test and then you use that as basis for hiring decision unless you can justify, you can show na ang kanina personality test is related to the job. For example, you've uncovered in research and there's a lot of citation and arguments that a person that is introverted is all is like sorry is or rather introversion predicts like accounting skills kana kung maka-justify ka na maka-back up ka na through research pwede ka mo gamit ana, so you can say that your test then is or has content validity. So unsa ni siyang test blueprint then? So test blueprint is a plan for the test structure including content areas, the number of items per area, and the organization. So in our laboratory pohon, you will get to experience making a test blueprint. And on the next slide, we will talk about content validity ratio, which you will also experience calculating. So unsa ang content validity ratio? Mani siya iyang formula. N sub E, which is the panelists indicating that an item is essential, minus N, which is the total number of panelists over 2 divided by N over 2. So, panalitan ay item 1, item 2, item 3. Ang buhaton sa panelists is ilan na siyang i-rate whether it is essential or not. So, panalitan na 10 ka panelists. Example na to 10 man. So, muna sila essential, not essential, or needs or item revision to be clear. So, ilan na check-on din ha. Nauna nila. Magsuway po ta ani no na ako'y form ani. So, mag-pretend ta na we are professionals and then mag-simulate ta how to do content validity ratio. And then, you compute it. Diba? Nagi math gyud. So, i-compute ni mo na siya. And then, usually, if you have half of the experts agreeing or saying that your item is essential, more than half, say 5 up, you would get a positive value na CVR. If you check the source that we have, there is a certain threshold or there's a certain like minimum number of CVR where you can say, okay, we can include this item because this item is essential to the construct that we want to test out or to the construct that we want to sample. So, mana siya no. If like half nila, 5 said that the item is essential and then 5 also said it's not essential, you'll get a 0 CVR. And then if less than half of the panelists would not say or would say that the item is essential, you would get a low CVR. So panalitan ang ang minimum number sa 10 ka panelists for you to consider an item to be part of your test blueprint or your test is 0.62. You can find that on page 179 according to Loshin or Losh. So you would then consider the item and then you would make it part of your kanang questionnaire or your scale. So nga na siya pag-compute. Actually, pretty fun na siya. Sa tanang topic sa validity, mo siya pinaka fun for me. Sige lang, kay right now good abstract ang concept. So, it will be hard to grasp. Pero once we conduct this one, malingaw ragid mo ani. And also, you can calculate it yourself. Pag try din ha, go over page 178. Sa yun education na competition. And then, pag sample-sample mo din na, what if na 5 ra kabuok panelists, pila man iyang CVR if like 3 ang mi-agree na ang item is essential over 5. So, we'll go over the second discussion question, which is a very fascinating real-world example. So, in Bosnia, students learn different versions of history depending on their ethnic background. So how does this illustrate the cultural relativity of content validity? So for example, katong Croatian students, no, they learn that Gavrilo Princip, the man who was assassinated or who assassinated Archduke Ferdinand, was a terrorist. And then Serbian students consider him as a hero and a poet. So, lain-laig view sa person. Now, if content validity depends on whether a test samples the right material, what happens when different groups disagree about what's right material or what the right material even is? So, can a history test be valid in one classroom but not in another? That's the question. So, what does this mean for international testing then? Can a test of intelligence be valid in US and also be valid in the Philippines? So, this is a powerful example of how culture shapes what we consider a valid content. And there's no universal truth here. Kay validity is always relative to context. Okay, so let's move on to criterion-related validity. So, naka-mention na ta content validity sa PICAS, no? Sa PICAS slide. Karon usa din ang criterion-related validity. First off, before understanding criterion-related validity, let's first understand what is a criterion. So, to help us understand this, I'm gonna put that into context, okay? So, panalitan, I have here a newly developed measure wherein I want to find out whether a student is successful sa ilang careers in the future. So, we call this the job success scale, JSP, basta JSP na prediction scale, JSPP. Okay, bago ni siya na akong i-develop na test. Now, how do I make sure na this test is valid? We compare it up against a criterion. Say for example, I want to find out, because this one aims to predict right the job success, and probably in my RRL or in how I conceptualize this scale, I mentioned job success as the supervisor's rating. Let's simplify it. Di ni gani ka simple ha, pero let's simplify it. So kung high kag supervisor rating, meaning nindot ka successful kasi mong job. So then I traced all the graduates of CTU. I asked their supervisor for their rating. Naman na sila performance feedback. Okay? And then this is my standard to where I compare and validate my test scores ani na test sa JSPP. So again, asa diri ang criterion? This one, the supervisor rating of all the graduates of CTU. Tanan nilang supervisor ratings na ako'y score, butangan ta ng X. And then, naapod ko score man produce ani na test, di ba? Butangan nato ni og X pod. X. Human, ang kaning tuha ka score, akong i-correlate. That is criterion-related validity. So, unsa gay ng criterion? It is the standard against which a test is evaluated. So, atong example kanina, no, job performance ratings, GPA, psychiatric diagnosis, o training cost. So, a textbook definition of criterion-related validity is that it is a judgment of how adequately a test score can be used to infer an individual's most probable standing on some measure of interest, or what we call the criterion. Okay? So far, so good. Nasabtan na usang criterion, o sa criterion-related validity. Ang inyo lang yung clue word ana is criterion. There is a criteria, so you're measuring a test score up against a certain criteria. Now, a good criteria or a good criterion has the following characteristics for it to be good. Diba? So first, it needs to be relevant. It needs to be valid. Then, it also needs to be uncontaminated. Kaning relevant, very ni siya, no? Very, very kanang sabotable. Panalitan sa ato ang example ganina, katong JSPP scale nato. What if magkuha ko og kanang GPA, diba, as a standard? Di man siya relevant because GPA is your score when you were still in school. It is not your measure of any sense, any measure, any indication of your success or your job performance. So then, your criterion should be relevant. And then next, it should be valid. Unsa nang valid? So panalitan, kato siya, maghatag tag another example. Kaning JSPP scale, newly developed version for Filipinos. Okay? JSPP scale or Job Success Prediction, ngano gitong usa ka P, basta Job Success Prediction Scale, JSPSDI. So Filipino version, pero naanay usa ka existing scale na gi-develop si butang talang si US, no, sa JSPP US scale ana something. So I first need to find and to support that my criterion has already very high Cronbach Alpha in terms of reliability and validity, meaning gold standard na ni siya na test. Mo ginamit na ni worldwide, ginamit na ni sa China, sa everywhere in the world no, and gi-replicate na ni kadaghan. So dapat ako standard valid siya. Kay if maghimo ko kanang if ako ang test score, if ako test score or ako ang newly developed measure, ako siyang i-compare og usa ka kanang test na dili pud hay og validity, what for, right? Does not make sense. Okay? Question mark, right? So dapat valid pa nimo ang test. Next, kani uncontaminated. This is quite a bit technical, so stay with me. Okay, so I'll do my best to make it sabotable. To make it, gihamos na ko class, honestly. Okay. Unsa ning criterion contamination? When do we say that a certain criteria is already contaminated? So say for example, I have here another scale. Okay, so I have here another scale. And this one here is a scale I developed to measure teachers' high performance. So we call this one high performance, a high performers teacher scale. Okay? So human kani ato na nibutangan og ana na label. Kay bati man ako ang kuan kanang cursor. So kani siya gikuha ni siya, gidevelop ni siya through compiling all the criteria of measuring how we can say na a teacher is performing well. So unsa ni siya? Students review, peer review, review sa deans, imong performance o review sa performance imong chair. So tananan 360-degree feedback. Tinako mo ko so what? 360-degree feedback. And so if akong gigamit ang criterion to measure its validity through the data that I gathered here, say for example, gias na ko ang mga deans. Na din, kuan, usay measure ani niya bi-evaluate atong tan-awon ang imong score ani nila mga teacher atong inyahuman mga ratings ni sa dean, di ba? So naa na score. Okay, naa na score, na igihatag score. So ako din gikuan ang score ani na scale. Naa na tay criterion contamination. Kay ngano man ang atong gigamit na standard, ang atong gigamit na criteria gikan man sa ato ang data na gikuha to create or to develop the test. Okay? Nasabtan ra? Char, mura ko kay ba? Murag baka kita sa iyong nang murag baka respond. Charot. Basta feeling ako nung nagtando-tando naman doon ha. Kaya mga bright man mo, kay ba ako nakasabot na mo ana tanan. Okay, so mo na siya. I'm sure nasabtan na gyud siya. I believe in you. Okay? So next, manata sa characteristics of a good criterion. Adto na pud ta sa types of a criterion validity na atay concurrent ug naputay predictive validity. So from the word itself, concurrent, current karon. Ang buhaton nani is simultaneous siya gibuhat. Okay? Ang test ug ang criterion. Okay? So pareha siya gibuhat at the same time. So sa example aning concurrent validity, katong example na to sa what do we consider a test to be valid? 'Di ba? We're comparing it against a standard a golden standard na test that's replicated everywhere, di ba? So if we do that, these two tests is still considered concurrent validity. Okay? So ang predictive validity is when you measure the criterion in the future pa. So this type of tools are meant to predict certain outcomes, certain behavior. So you're asking here, how well does this test that I develop predict what will happen in the future or in some future time? So kani siya again is current standing, current abilities, comparing it to example, an already existing test, a already diagnosed set of kanang patients, but this one in the future pa siya buhaton. Okay? Katong example nako na teacher's performance, right? So I could probably look katong example nako rather sa mga graduates on how they perform well in their jobs is an example of predictive validity. Sige, so hatagan ta mo another example para mas maklaro siya. So example ani concurrent validity no kanay si Beck depression inventory, you validate it against diagnosis by experience cognitions. So the two are both taken at the same time, and then once you got the scores of the two, you correlate it, and then the correlation shows how well this one matches established criterion, which is our diagnosis score sa clinicians. Now, if we get a good correlation of the two, then we can use the test and we can conclude that we can use the test to help us create a faster and less expensive na diagnosis if we can establish its concurrent validity. And then ang predictive validity, katong example na to sa previous slide wherein we have the college admission test, is our test score. Okay? Our entrance exam is our test score. We have a test. Now, the criterion will be taken at a later time to help us validate whether the admission test really predicts getting good students or getting students who score high in their keys. So meaning, ang criterion later na siya gikuha. Once we get the two, we correlate it, ang iyang result shows how well the test predicts future outcomes. Okay? Kani, na ay alternative, right? Kani, it helps decision makers to select certain people for their organization. For schools, entrance exam, we select students na very high in EQ and IQ, right? Or good speakers. In psychology, we're looking at someone that's really good in research, math, English, and science, right? So, if we kung katong entrance exam na inyohang gitake, atoa na siyang i-correlate sa inyohang score later, at a later time, then there's a good correlation or a coefficient out of that. We then conclude that the admission test is valid or has predictive validity. So, ang key question ani is, when is it measured ang criterion? If it's the same time, it's concurrent. If it's at a later date or it's a future time na to makuha ang criterion, then it's predictive validity. Okay? Let's move on. Let's talk about the validity coefficient. Ang coefficient sa validity, kind of like the reliability coefficient, is still measuring it through correlation. We usually use Pearson R. Okay, so we test the relationship between the test score and the criterion score. Now, unlike reliability, you're looking at the consistency. Test produce the same test score as to the next. But this one, you're comparing it against a standard. I know, maglibog siya kay ngano, pareha ra man gud siya process, pero lahi siya goal. Okay? A reliability, you're looking at consistency of scores. Reliable ba ni siya na test? Dili ba ni siya very vulnerable to weather conditions, to other sani kanang scorer variables, may nga na ba? Validity, there's a standard. Like this developed test really measure what I want it to measure. Does it capture the mermaid? Not an important consideration. For example, ang restriction of range. Saan ni siya ang restriction of range? If ang imuhang kuha ng mga samples or imuhang gi-test out ng mga samples, mga group of people na example na akay kanang high performers scale develop and imo na siya gisample out of those na nadawat og mga job interviews, technically you're restricting a range. Nga naman ang katong mga nadawat og job interviews usually have the characteristics that are already needed to be successful in a job. So you artificially lower, you weaken the validity coefficient kay imo magi-restrict ang range. So imagine drawing ta ko ba, cooperate mouse. So imagine this is the plot. And then naatay imagine ni siyang murag ulod na group of people ni siya. Ang imo gibuhat is imo siyang gikat, no? So may tabuan na anay na nagnaong. Ana, di ba? So meaning, di siya kakaingon na murag duha man ko sa imuhang result kay kanang cut man gud imuhang population, dili jud kakaingon na valid imuhang scores na makuha kay wala man nimo na apil ning mga lower kuan katong mga people na wala na successful sa job, right? Di ka discriminate tarong. So, gana na siya restriction of range. Next is incremental validity. Say I have two predictors of job success. I have kanang discipline, scoring discipline, and then scoring discipline and persistence. Oh, panalitan, persistence and discipline. Now, okay, if I try to correlate the two, we're still talking about the R value, no correlation. If it yields very high R value, we probably have to be wary of the two predictors, discipline and persistence, because they might be measuring the same thing. Now, if it's not too high ang R value niya, meaning to say the two can be kanang included. Kaya ang incremental validity looks at how much a new predictor adds beyond what existing predictors already explain. Okay? So I want you to look at the values here. Kung less than 0.80 ang R, say for example, 89, 81, may nga na ba? So we know that they're related. No, they have good correlation, but they're still measuring different constructs. Okay? So if it's 0.80 and 0.89, we need to be a bit careful and we need to have good arguments why we're trying to measure two different things, even if they're very strongly related. To explain the overlap, what could be causing the high correlation of these two variables, and why do I still need to separate them? Why? Kaya nga no, ma-question man ang incremental validity ani. does it really measure something new? Does it add a new information? Diba? And then this one, if ang imuhang duha ka constructs, no, is 0.90, remember sa reliability, nindot ni siya, right? For high stakes decisions. But sa validity, medyo makuan ka ani, no? Maingon ka na, okay, are you really measuring something new? So, why not just measure that one construct since high na kayo siya, validity coefficient, taas na kayo siya, it probably didn't add anything new to the kuan, to the bucket. No? So, wala siya incremental validity. Mo na siya, you probably have a redundancy problem. Remember, sa katong item nato sa kanang sa taga ni kanang content ba sa reliability sa item. So kung makakita kag 0.90 ana na item, you probably need to remove that item because it's not adding anything new to the whole thing. Okay, it probably is the same for the other for example si item 2, 0.99 probably is measuring what item 3 already measured, nga na ba? So it's still a number na you need to be careful of if higher than siya. One of them might be unnecessary. Remember, wanong might man, no? Kay we cannot be entirely sure unless we review the literature na, okay, the two things are really just measuring the same thing. Dili magod ingon, di magod na siya clear cut, no, na black and white, na, 0.90 na, 0.90 above na imuhang score, tanggalan na siya na predictor, tanggalan na siya na item. No, you need to check the literature. You need to check the RRL, how it is conceptualized. You need to review the theories that it is grounded on. Nga numang, imo po siyang i-retain despite the high value. But this one here really needs very strong arguments why you're retaining it. Here, I'll give you an example. Mentioned this one already. How high should it be? So, wala siya fixed rules again. Depende na siya sa imuhang judgment. That's why, mga anak ko, nadiligid siya clear cut. Okay? But, you need to be wary of if igani na imuhang values. No fixed rules. Okay? Example. Example, we have here the construct. Time studying, and then you correlate it with GPA. So studying and GPA has a 0.79 na correlation. Now, that's good, right? That's a high correlation. And then we then correlate staying in the library with GPA. Kaning duha, okay? Library and GPA yields a 0.85. That is very high. Pero once we correlate the two, studying and library, that is also very high, 0.86. So here, probably can think na, okay, library and studying, most people who studied are probably in the library, right? So, library in a sense did not really add something new. Gamay siya incremental validity. Tap man siya ani na predictor, kaning studying. Pero if we have another predictor, which is sleeping and GPA, when you correlate the two, taas siya. And then when you correlate sleep and studying, that is 0.70. Remember this one here? So 0.70 is relatively good. So you add on sleep. Tanawon po na ninyo, di lang mo magtanaw sa number ana, tanawon ninyo ang kanang conceptualization ana, di ba? Og ang kuan ni ba, imuhang judgment jud imong tanawon. So maka-conclude dayon ta na ang sleep na siya good incremental validity because it measures something different. Di ba? You cannot really say that people in the library are sleeping, or you cannot say na people who are studying are also all sleeping, right? So dili man siya na ma-add on siya, meaning to say rest, and you add on studying, you add on rest, good rest, it will give you a high GPA. No? So, ingana na siya. I have here the next discussion question, which is our third discussion question to help us apply what we just discussed. Now, I really want you to interact with our discussion questions kay dili man gyud mo maka-test out gyud kung dili passive in your learning good. It also helps you become active learners or active interaction with this one. So, an airline wants to develop a test for hiring pilots. What should they prioritize? Should they prioritize concurrent validity or should they prioritize predictive validity? Knowing what you know about the difference between the two and their purpose, unsa man ilang dapat gamiton? Unsa man ilang goal? Is it to identify a current skill or is it to identify a predictive future success? Why do you think so? Okay? I'll leave you with that. I won't answer. Okay. Very obvious if you've just digested what we talked about a while ago. That's very obvious ang answer. So next, let's move on to construct validity. And this is kind of a big one. It's a big deal in this field of psychometrics because some researchers call it the umbrella under which all validity falls or all validity type falls. So, unsay kuan sa construct validity? No, unsay main question niya. Ang iyang question is, does the test actually measure the construct it claims to measure? Pero unsay gyud na ang construct? Diba nagbalik-balik na taani? You know this one already. So, again, a construct is an informed scientific idea developed to describe or explain behavior. So, unobservable siya and i-hypothesize siya. Okay? So, for example, sa mga constructs there, love, intelligence, attractiveness, anxiety, all of them, they're constructs. Okay? And again, ang kuha na ning construct is unobservable siya. So, dili man ta ka directly kita sa love, di ba? Makitaan ba dahil na ang love, di ba? Di man na directly makita, unlike sa ballpen na nasa atubangan ninyo. Abstract concepts man na siya. And ang atong makitaan, rather, are behaviors. So, if you love a person, probably imo na siyang kutawag kapi, imong permi kuan og nikaon na ka, di ba? Karaan na nanay. Napa na until now sa naman day ang kuan ron or mga igana, right? So just ako na ang kanang mo text og nikaon na kadili na siya kanang evidence of love ha kay basig feeling ninyo love na mo na person ko textan mo nikaon na ka. So anyway, going back, okay, we need to build evidence that our test actually taps into this invisible thing. So kailangan ta mo build og evidence through the behavioral observations. So unsaon na siya pag-build nga ni ang process, no? Pag-process sa kuan sa contract validity. First is that there is a hypothesis, right? We formulate a hypothesis and we hypothesize how high scorers and low scorers should behave differently. And then after, mo develop ta og theory about the construct. And after that, we test whether the behavior match our prediction of how that construct performs or functions. So, example pa jud ani na kuan na process is when you will already develop your own scale. So, possibly imuhang mga na-observe sa society, wala pa gyud nakahimuan na. So, mo ni mo buhaton mo, determine mo kung kana inyong construct sa mo na tag uh, the ghost the brain rot na construct. Okay, so tanaw na to sa may behavior sa high scorers of having a brain rot and low scorers of having a brain rot. And then mukuan din ta develop tag theory ato na siyang i-compare og anchor sa existing theory of how those two usually perform. And then atong i-test whether ang behavior match our theory or our predictions. If it does, then meaning we can't validate na okay sakto di atong test, it really captures, no, it has good construct validity. Pero if not, there are two things: you either first re-examine your test because it possibly did not capture what you theorize, or you re-examine your theory because it probably is, because of changing society or changing world, it's no longer fitted to the contemporary world, no, the current world that we live in. So if we put it into context sa to example about brain rot, for example, ang behavior sa brain rot usually, 'di ba? Example lang niya is fatigue and shortened attention span. Now, ang test bali pagkita nimo sa results, 'di ba? Nabantayan ninyo na usually ang imong gipredict na taas og brain rot scores rather are high performers. Di ba, imo nga magi-predict sa mga taas og brain rot scores is say na fatigue, gamay attention span, low scorer sa intelligence, low performance sa school. Yep, pagka-collect na nimo sa data, imong nabantayan lahi lagi ang result na ni gawas. So kung makakita ka na lahi ang result, dili man meaning ana nabati na dayon. It just means you need to re-examine. You re-examine, you revisit either your test because there must be something wrong in the way you designed it, in the way you create the content of it, no, the items of the test, or there must be something that you should change in your conceptualization, in your theory. Possible siguro na is something other than brain rot that made the test results contrary to your predictions na wala siya nagmatch. Sa karon, kaning construct validity mo jud ni pinaka important, no, na kanang unifying concept in terms of validity. So ang kani siyang katong gidiscuss na content validity or criterion validity, it all are just part of a big puzzle. So first you need to satisfy this one first before you check whether there is content and criterion validity. And then speaking of, unsaon din nato pag-gather og evidence sa construct validity. So daghan tag approaches, no? Na mention na atay homogeneity, na atay mga changes with age, test post-test, no, contrast it to different groups, discriminant evidence, convergent evidence, and factor analysis. Now, this one is a lesson in advanced statistics. So, masteral level ni siya. So, dili lang kayo ta mo touch on the detailed anino kay kanang even mga masteral students na maglisod pag grasp ani. And although although I would love to teach you how to do this, no, I don't think I still have the time and the scale because nice unta na makaton mo ani pero sa masteral level naman ni siya. So, anyway, ang concept lang atong i-master, no? Ang what is it about and how is it used in terms of talking about validity. So, unsa nang homogeneity? Let's start first with homogeneity, meaning, I think this is already a familiar word, no? Na tanan di ang construct, nagmeasure siya og taas siya correlation sa imuhang total test score. Mura gid na siya. So, for example, pwede po ni dili item ang storyaan, pwede po mga subscale, di ba? Example, ang test. Kuya, one ni no? Example, ang test, naa siya subscale 1, subscale 2, subscale 3. Okay, example, no? Example, ang construct, overall construct umbrella na burnout, naa siya subscale na disengagement, low professional efficacy, o usa pa ng o kanang exhaustion. So ang buhaton ani sa homogeneity is imong i-correlate ni siyang subscale 1, 2 and 3 sa total score sa test. If makita nimo na taas siya Pearson R, taas siya R value, then we can conclude na ang tulo is homogeneous to the total test score, meaning high correlation, so they are measuring the same thing. So isud siya sa test. Now, may may tabo if naiusa sa ila gamay og R value, say ang kaning exhaustion construct is 0.112. So 12 ay 0.001 na lang 0.01. So meaning 10% ira yang ko ano, yang R value. Wato na is imong probably tanggalon ni siya na subscale kay wala siya ni measure sa construct. Or wala di siya same og gi-measure ba, meaning probably kani siya na construct or subscale, wala din ni siya nag-measure o burnout. So, mangita taglain na musulod sa tulo. Or possible po na duha gid ay ang subscale sa burnout. Same po na sa test item. So, makita mo na test item na gamay og R value, imo na siyang tanggalon. Because possibly, dili na siya, wala siya ni indicate or wala siya ni measure sa construct na imo ganahan i-measure. Nardiyan ang homogeneity, okay? Next is changes with age, okay? So, ang construct, it changes over time. So, ang scores, it should predict also those changes. Di ba dili man na stationary ang construct? Because remember, the constructs is anchored in a society, in the people, and people change. Okay? So, kailangan, as you know, as kids grow older, your test should also reflect the changes of that. So, another form of getting evidence for construct validity is pre-test and post-test of your test. So, panalitan na atay kung ano, burnout lang kong gamit because that is my favorite or area of interest. So, example, natay burnout scale na akong gi-develop. So, nakoy intervention here, intervention, butang tag intervention, circle lang. Nakoy intervention na makalesen, presumably makalesen sa burnout. Now, if ang population, ako ang sample, scored high in burnout, after the intervention, it scored low on burnout, meaning low ilang burnout score after the intervention, then the test, we can possibly kanang hypothesize or we can conclude that the tests really measure burnout and also that the intervention worked. So the pre-test post-test could be an evidence of construct validity. And also we can do that by contrasting it with different groups. So for example, if we have people who are known to have low in burnout and they are like rated by psychologists, for example. Okay, this group of people or this group of 100 individuals are people who scored low in burnout. Now, if I compare it to a group wherein they also scored high in burnout, and if I see a statistical difference or a significant difference between the two using a statistical measure called t-test, I'm sure you're familiar of this one. Okay, two groups man siya. Okay, to people who scored in burnout. This is also an evidence of construct validity if the groups differ, no, on the construct. So, another example is hospitalized depressed patients score higher on depression scales than the general population. So, also, math wizard scale score high on the mathematical ability compared to a random sample of also 100 people of different backgrounds, different mathematical abilities. So, makainguntan na kanina mathematical ability test score then really have an evidence of construct validity. Okay, hope that's clear. And then next we have discriminant evidence and convergent evidence. So yun na ni sabton ang duha. From the word converge, meaning, sample na ay test score, na ay various old tests, and you correlate them, and they all have significant correlations to the test, then that means that we have convergent evidence. So, meaning ana, na akay new anxiety measure, for example, new anxiety scale, yung imo siyang gi-correlate sa established and older versions of the scale. So kani sila na mga older versions, established na ni sila. So meaning mo na ni sila ang murag ka ng ginagamit na gid ba dugay na, pero naay reason for you developing it probably kay na change sa society etc. So if magka-correlate og taas, imo i-correlate ninya taas sila og score, meaning na kay evidence of convergent validity. So high correlations with other tests measuring the same or similar constructs. Okay? It could be na mo correlate mo using another related construct, dili the same test that was developed years and years ago. Pwede po na, no? So, for example, ganahan ka mo kuan og academic stress. Unsa may related construct ana? Possibly, stress in general or general stress scale, di ba? So, they're both measuring stress. So, if taas ilang correlation, say, imong correlation sa kanina related construct, then you still have convergent evidence. Ang discriminant evidence, kung kani siya pariha, kani siya lahi. So, panalitan, naa kay test, imo na siyang i-correlate sa measure na dili mo measure sa imong construct of interest. And if we have low R, then we can say we have discriminant evidence. So example ani, marital satisfaction test shows low correlation with social desirability. So katong example sa kanang sige tong example nato ani. Example ani, stress day no. Example unsa may construct na dili gyud pareha sa stress, no makaingon tag lahi gyud siya sa stress. Panalitan, gamay na ko niya to make the ideas kanang simple, panatag chill life. The chill life score. So kung low og correlation ning duha, then we have a discriminant evidence. So low correlations with measure of construct that should not be related. Now, factor analysis is a statistical method identifying underlying factors that show what the test measures and how dimensions relate. So nata exploratory and confirmatory approaches. So usually, ang kaning factor analysis, it's a data reduction na technique. Kani siyang factor analysis because it is very technical and lisod siya gyud i-compute na ani siya kanang computer program to help us do it. So usually SPSS can also do factor analysis. Other prepackaged na mga computer program can also kanang conduct factor analysis. Pero usually ang pag name sa construct is kuan sa researcher na siya na kanang pag name sa new factor na mo emerge. Again, di na kay ta mo dive through kay very complicated. So we have here the fourth discussion question for a lecture. So this will play out your idea about validity, no, and imuhang judgment. So there is a new creativity test that you develop or a researcher develops. Now, when they validated it, it correlated very highly with IQ tests. Now, ang question for you to ponder upon is, does this support or challenge construct validity? So we ask now, are creativity and intelligence related or the independent constructs? So, unsa may indiscriminate evidence pod for a creativity test. Now, nganon tricky ni siya. This is usually very debated in literature, in research. Tricky siya because some would argue na creativity is part of intelligence. For you to be creative, you probably have a high IQ, right? Opo na lang ingon, kana daw mga people with good humor, they have high IQ daw because they're very witty. They can watch and observe society and they can make fun of it. So, may argument nga na pero na po yung ingon na distinct man ang creativity sa IQ kay you can be very smart but you're not creative. How about people that are very logical, very statistical, very good in statistics and math but not so good in the arts, di ba? Na may nga na dili traditionally or kanang smart but uncreative or creative pero dili traditionally intelligent. So, if they correlate too highly, maybe we're just measuring intelligence twice. Pero in a sense, no? So, mo na siyang challenging when we're talking about validity. Kay, when we're talking about validity, you're not just employing statistical treatment to determine whether they are valid or not. Or you're not just using formula and math and numbers to determine whether validity exists. It requires your judgment as a professional, as a researcher. It requires your argumentation. It requires your conceptualization. Mo ana ang ubano na kanang, sayo na kayo maghimog RRL ron, i-AI ra nato na. Okay, but mind you, when we're making the scales later on, na nata sa atong laboratory after midterms, I would look at how you defend your construct or your write-up. I would probably just scan through your writings. I would look at your arguments, okay? So, para makabawdyo ko na, okay, this group really did read, no, really did understand what they're developing. Okay, again, when you're establishing validity, you're not just using statistics to And then mauna na siya, no? It requires your judgment. It requires your insight as a human person. Okay? So, mo na siya. Next na ta. Ako na nga saba ha. I still believe the value in AI, pero again, it's a tool like any others. Let's move on to test bias. Now, this one, no, when we say bias, there is a negative connotation, especially sa colloquial meaning niya. When we say bias, it's unfair, etc., di ba? Pero in the definitions of psychometrics, it is inherent in the test, no, that systematically prevents accurate and impartial measurement. Keyword ani niya is systematic. So mura siya natay ko ano weighted coin analogy. The coin here represents your measure. So say ang coin imong na pabugat sa head side. So bugat siya intentionally sa head side. So inig isa nimo imbis na 50% probability in heads and tails, mahimo na noong 75-25%. So 75% for the coin and for the head and then 25% for the tail. So kasi may tabuan ni. Mura na siya test bias nga naman cause it usually ang outcome is 50-50 na himo na noong on the head side 75 on the tail side 25. Okay, so unsa na siyang test bias, meaning ang imong nakuha, no, ang imong nakuha is an outcome that is not related to the actual trait that you want to measure. So mura po na example, intelligence test scores nga nakabantay ka, usually mugawas ni siya sa mga race ba. Kabantay ang kuan inig analyze sa test scores na mas tako lagi nig score ang westerners. No, those people living in the western countries like US, Europe, compared to people that are living in the kanang indigenous or part of an indigenous groups, Native Americans or indigenous groups in the Philippines, di ba? So they probably have captured something that's not really about intelligence. So mo na siyang test bias. Okay? So what are types of test bias? The first type is intercept. No, test systematically overpredicts or underpredicts for a certain group. And then slope bias is that there are different validity coefficients for different groups. So inig very math na magud kaayo. So kanang if you read through nay ana sa book, di ba? And mabantayan ninyo kung asa siya ni kuan ni hit through even if the same siya score sa both groups. Lahi siya og slope or sorry, lahi siya y-intercept. So panalitan kani siya diri kay kanang 45. Ya kani siya diri 50 po diyang score pero yung y-intercept kay kuan kanang 60. So, mo na siya ang kanang miingon tag na siya bias, no? Sa 2, intercept bias and validity and slope bias. Now, when talking about statistical bias, I want you to understand this very important point. Okay, na adri speakas. So, when we say that a test is kanang a test, example kanino si group X and group Y, there are real differences between the two. We cannot automatically assume that if there are differences between the two groups, a test is already biased. Again, I want to reiterate, a test is not automatically biased just because there are differences between two groups. For example, there is a mathematical ability test, and then we answered it for men, and we let it answer for women as well. And we find that, so let's change the construct because that even in literature is still debatable, no, ang mathematical ability. Let's say emotional sensitivity, kay kana siya, kay very daghang matag evidence on that. And men scored low on that, women scored high in that. So it does not automatically say na bias ni siya. Okay, emotional sensitivity scale. Uy, this is bias against men, no, na scale. No, it just reflect real variation. There are real differences in emotional sensitivity, probably because of how roles are constructed. Men are raised differently than women, or maybe there are really biological differences between men and women in terms of emotional sensitivity. So bias then is just about systematic error. It's not group differences. Okay? Again, bias is about systematic error, not real group differences. Kinata na, kinata, kay gikapoy nako. Alita sa common rating errors, sayo na kani siya subtune. Panalitan, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 na rating scale. Unsa ni siya ang leniency error? Rating errors happen because of errors sa raters, errors sa rating. Very easy to understand. So panalitan, na kay survey. Okay? And then ako, rater ko, ako siyang answeran og 1 consistently, 1 or 2. 1, 2, 1. Checkan ako, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. That is leniency error. That is severity error din na siya, rating too harshly. So, ang leniency error bali, sige ko grade og 4, 4, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5, 5. So, mo na siya, leniency error. So, kamo, pohon mag-survey mo, inyo na siyang tanawon na mga nag-answer sa survey no, na puro ra nag 5, 5, 5, 5, 5. Ina siya tanggalon, kay mo mess up na sa inyong analysis man o validity sa inyong results. So, another is central tendency. Kani po mo na makakita mo og ubang mga scales or survey na walay neutral, walay number 3, to prevent central tendency na errors. Kasagaran man good sa mga test taker, mo answer po sila 3 tanan. No, neutral, neutral, neutral. So, na to pagkakuha og nindot na insight anang maigana ng mga test scores or ratings, right? So, manang uban, i-omit yun na nila ang number 3 sa ilahang measurement. And then next is halo effects. Very, very easy to understand, no? So, panalitan ni apply si Beyonce. Beyonce sa kanang kuan. Mahimong student sa CTU. Si Beyonce niya. Kaya niya human, ako, nagkugupahan ni Beyonce, oy, sige, check ni tanan. Sa bugo umat, check. O, Beyonce, kaya baka mo research siya. Well, I only know researching in concerts and something like that. O, check. Sige, kay si Beyonce man, nanatay halo effect. No, one trait influences all ratings. So, bias ni siya. Kani rating errors, bias ni siya sa rater, no, sa judgment sa rater. So, ato na ta sa test fairness. Kaning test fairness, related siya sa bias, pero separate gini siya na issue. Okay? So, nganong separate man? Fairness, it's about whether a test is using an impartial or kanang equitable na kanang testing or pag-use niya sa test ba. Ang bias rather is rooted on properties sa test itself. Diba? When we say bias, it could be like, diba, nag-capture siya something other than the trait. Kind of like, remember I talked about systematic error? So it's a systematic measurement error. So it is a statistical or technical issue ang bias. Pero ang fairness, it's rooted in values and ethics of a society. Example, example ba, historical example sa Soviet Union wherein they use the test to suppress mga against nila. So that is an example of unfair use sa test, right? So in a sense, dili siya rooted on a statistical issue or a measurement error. Rather, it is in how a person is using it, a value or ethics sa society or sa test developer. Okay? And there is a crucial point with all this. A perfectly valid unbiased test can still be used unfairly. So, if they use a psychiatric test that is perfectly valid, very less bias or little to non-existent bias, but they're still using it to suppress people who are against the government, that is an example of an unfair use of test. Okay, so I hope that's clear. So let's go over here wherein we discuss myths, okay, in terms of test fairness. So myth number 1 is that tests that find group differences are unfair. The reality is, why is this considered a myth? Because test differences may actually reflect real variation. I mentioned this one already during discussions of test bias. So it's not technically unfairness, okay? And then number 2 is tests are unfair if the standardization sample excluded certain groups. So it may be biased but must be determined statistically. So you cannot really certainly conclude na kanang ang sampling niya, for example, is mga Westerners tanan and it excluded minority groups. Sure, we can say, okay, there is a sampling bias, but we can only conclude that once we back it up with data. So, inga na siya, no? Di ta ka diretso. Kailangan yun mag-go hand-in-hand ang statistics and your judgment. Responsibility for fairness, gishare na siya sa tanan. Gishare na siya sa developers, no, which provides evidence of validity. Gishare na siya sa test users, which apply the test. Gishare na siya sa test users, which apply the test fairly, meaning standardized kita na niyang pag-use, pag-implement. And gigamit po na siya sa society in general, which create laws to make the testing or the entire process fair for everyone. Unang na ay laws. Remember chapter 1 na naatay laws that guards proper usage of tests. So, mo na siya, no? It is shared by everyone. The responsibility is shared by everyone. Now, let's proceed to our final discussion question. And it's kind of a tough one. So, for example, a university uses an admission test that is a psychometrically valid but results in fewer students from low-income backgrounds being admitted. Is this test fair? So, who decides what's fair, what trade-offs are acceptable? So, meaning, is a valid test automatically a fair test? That's the core question. So I want you to think very hard about this one. Kay, there's no easy answer here. Kay, you know, as mentioned from our previous discussion questions, na the ideas are abstract and socially constructed. Therefore, it is highly debated by people. So some would argue na if the test validly predicts success, then well, it's fair. Using it is fair if it indeed selects the best students. Pero others would argue na if the test is if the test discriminates, the word discriminate here being used psychometrically against a certain group of people, then it can't be fair kay we're discriminating against a certain group of people who usually score low with this test. So there must be something that we need to do para ma-fair ang usage sa test for everyone, taking it regardless of their socioeconomic status. So again, this is an ongoing debate sa education and psychology, and you'll encounter it throughout your careers. In fact, there was an issue I guess that was 2 years ago or a year ago, wherein there was like a debate with regards to sa exam sa UP daw na mo discriminate manig low income backgrounds because kanang inyong pag-administer sa test mga bright na people, and then low income ang mga people na with low income background usually don't have the resources no and the proper nutrition to develop healthy brains, which is research where there is findings of that sa research jud na because of improper nutrition and then sleep and then sa ilang pong environment, they probably have not exhausted their potential because of these environmental constraints, of these systematic constraints. So your testing then is an unfair method, no, an unfair procedure. And some would argue na well, kanang we wanted to really select the best students. So using this type of procedure is just fair because there are real differences and we cannot help with that. Di ba? Naman nga ng argument. So that's why this type of issues is really needs to be taken into good consideration, in proper discussion, proper exchanges of ideas. So we're done. Let's wrap up with key takeaways. So number one is that validity is about how well a test measures what it claims to measure. Pero remember na it's not a fixed property. It depends on the context, the population, of course, the purpose. And then face validity is about an appearance from the test taker's view. It matters for acceptance. Kaya di ko ano ni siya no judgment of the test taker dili sa kanang development or everything, no, it doesn't guarantee actual validity. In fact, some researchers don't even consider this part of validity. And then number three is that content validity asks whether the test adequately samples the behavior domain. We can quantify this using CVR, which you will undergo during our laboratory. So I'm excited for you, Annie, sa CVR. And then next is criterion related, no, concurrent, same time versus predictive in the future. We use validity coefficients in getting this one. And then construct validity asks whether the test measures the theoretical construct that we want to capture. It claims to measure, and usually construct validity is regarded as the umbrella construct of validity. So the first and foremost kanisa ang satisfy before the other two they're just part of a big jigsaw puzzle. And then next is bias is not the same as group differences. Okay, so it is a systematic measurement error. And then of course values, or rather kanang fairness kay kuan siya values judgment siya your insight as a person, as a researcher, and that is a very separate issue from validity and bias, which can be remedied by statistical kanang measurement or statistical aid. Fairness then is a societal issue to deal with, or concept to debate against with. And yeah, the take home message of this one is that wala may universally valid na test. We always consider the purpose, the population, and the context of it all. Thank you so much for listening. Gihangos jud ko, next meeting or next lecture, we will be discussing test utility. Right? See you next lecture. Goodbye, everyone.